On a cold Georgia night, the highway stretched like an endless ribbon of darkness beneath a moonless sky. Traffic thinned, lights blurred, and silence wrapped around everything except the hum of engines cutting through Interstate 85. It was just past midnight when a black Mercedes eased into the right lane, traveling at the speed limit, steady, controlled, almost serene against the chaos of the world around it. Inside sat Judge Sarah Nelson, calm, sharp, and exhausted after hours of reviewing a case file that would shape the morning ahead. She had no idea that within minutes, her entire life would collide violently with the very system she upheld. Flashing blue lights exploded behind her, shattering the quiet night. She slowed carefully, performed every step with impeccable precision, hands visible, movements slow, because she knew what could happen when assumptions filled the void where facts belonged. Officer Blake Horton approached the car with a certainty that didn't come from evidence, but from a story he had already written in his mind. He grabbed the registration from her hand, didn't bother reading it, tossed it aside with a carelessness that spoke volumes. The moment he slammed her against her own car door, tearing her coat, pressing her cheek into cold metal, one thing became clear. This wasn't a stop. This was a judgment before truth. She spoke calmly, professionally, revealing her identity, offering verification, but her words bounced off the officer like they were whispers against a steel wall. A second officer arrived, Sergeant Webb, someone who had walked this road with Horton before, affirming him with subtle nods and coded phrases. Behind them stood Officer Tyler Brooks, a rookie whose silence held more weight than any words he could have spoken. His dash cam quietly recorded everything. Sarah didn't fight, didn't plead. She simply existed in a moment that should never have happened, knowing the morning would be her battlefield. She was handcuffed, processed, humiliated, and placed in a holding cell for a crime that didn't exist. But within her silence grew something far more dangerous than anger: calculation. Because unknown to Horton, the woman he arrested wasn't just innocent. She was the judge presiding over his excessive force trial in less than 10 hours. And the night he believed he owned would soon become the day that destroyed him. Morning broke with a cold, unforgiving clarity as Sarah stepped out of the precinct, released without charges, without apologies, and without acknowledgement of the violation she endured. The air felt sharper than usual, biting her skin the same way the handcuffs had bitten her wrists the night before. She retrieved her Mercedes from the impound lot, noting the scratches on the door, permanent marks created by the very officers sworn to protect citizens like her. She didn't break down. She didn't hesitate. She drove home with the eerie calm of someone who had already mapped the next several steps in her mind. When she entered her house, her husband Ethan, an attorney who loved her with both his heart and his logic, was waiting. His face shifted from fear to anger to confusion as he tried to make sense of her condition and her silence. But Sarah didn't explain yet. She showered, dressed, and when she finally emerged with her judicial robes folded neatly over her arm, she delivered only the truth he needed in that moment. She had been arrested for stealing her own car and impersonating a public official. Ethan erupted with the instinct to sue, to press charges, to ignite a legal firestorm, but she stopped him with a single sentence: "I am handling this my way." She didn't need revenge. She needed justice. And justice, when wielded correctly, had a far longer reach than anger. She told him to meet her at the courthouse at 8:45 a.m., just minutes before she would take her seat on the bench. Minutes before Officer Horton would walk into a courtroom expecting to defend himself against one excessive force complaint, never imagining he had already planted the seeds of his own downfall. As she drove to the courthouse, her mind replayed the night, but not emotionally, strategically. She saw every violation like a checklist, every word spoken as evidence, every decision made by Horton and Webb as threads in a larger pattern she would soon expose. She reached her chambers quietly, reviewed his case file one last time, and prepared for the moment when truth and authority would collide in a courtroom filled with people who had no idea what storm was about to hit them. When she stepped into her robe, it wasn't clothing, it was armor. And by the time she walked into the courtroom, the only person unaware of the disaster about to unfold was the man who caused it. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet routine as lawyers arranged files, the prosecution reviewed motions, and the gallery settled into their seats. Everything looked normal until Horton walked through the door. He entered wit, the steady confidence of a man who believed he understood the battlefield. He had ironed his uniform, polished his shoes, rehearsed his defense, and convinced himself the excessive force case against him was manageable, explainable, another day in the system that usually protected him. But the moment Sarah stepped through the judge's entrance, ascending the bench with quiet authority, time itself seemed to clench. Horton froze mid-step. His face drained, his lungs seized, and the truth detonated inside him like a bomb he never saw coming. His judge, the woman who would decide his fate, was the same woman he had violently arrested less than a day earlier. His briefcase slipped from his fingers, echoing across the courtroom as he stumbled backward into his seat, gripping the table to stay upright. Even his lawyer was stunned, unable to hide the dread sinking into his expression. The gallery murmured, confused but sensing something seismic was unfolding. Sarah didn't rush. She didn't glare. She simply arranged her documents with the calm precision of someone entirely in control. Then she addressed the room with a formal disclosure that shattered every remaining illusion. She recounted her arrest, every detail, every violation, stated plainly, factually, without emotion. The courtroom erupted, gasps, whispers, disbelief rippling through every row. Horton's breathing turned ragged as he realized there was no path out of this. His lawyer, desperately trying to maintain professionalism, objected to her refusal to recuse herself, but Sarah shut it down with legal precision. She would preside because doing so ensured absolute fairness, fairness Horton had denied her. And with that ruling, the balance of power shifted irreversibly. The prosecution presented the original excessive force evidence. Sarah scrutinized every second, looking at it with new eyes, eyes sharpened by first-hand violation. She asked targeted questions that exposed patterns, inconsistencies, and intent. Then, just when the proceedings reached the edge of revelation, the courtroom doors opened. Detective Riley from Internal Affairs entered with a sealed folder, carrying evidence gathered in the hours since the arrest. And suddenly, this wasn't just a trial about one incident. It became an indictment of a pattern. A pattern Horton thought would remain buried, until the wrong stop on the wrong night placed him in front of the one woman who could destroy the entire facade. What followed was no longer a simple hearing. It became a public unmasking. Internal Affairs presented dashcam footage from Officer Brooks, the rookie who stood silently at the traffic stop the previous night. His camera captured everything: Sarah's compliance, Horton's aggression, Webb's enabling nods, the systematic escalation that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with prejudice. Then came the audio from Horton's own body cam, audio he didn't realize still recorded after he turned the camera off. His voice filled the courtroom, revealing words sharper than any blade, mocking Sarah, dismissing her credentials, openly stating she matched the profile. The courtroom fell into an electric silence. Every person present heard it, racial bias spoken aloud, unfiltered, unmasked. Horton tried to rise, tried to explain, but Sarah's command sliced through the tension. "Sit down." It wasn't anger, it was authority reclaiming itself. Internal Affairs then laid out the pattern: 11 nearly identical traffic stops in 18 months, all black drivers, all luxury vehicles, all arrested, all charges dropped. And then came the connecting thread, Lieutenant Dresden quietly erasing Horton's complaint history, burying misconduct reports, protecting a pattern the department didn't want exposed. This wasn't just one officer, it was a system with cracks, shadows, and cover-ups. Sarah listened, composed yet unmovably firm. The courtroom became a place where truth finally had weight. When the evidence concluded, she addressed Horton directly, not emotionally but judicially. She showed him the case file he had forced her to review the previous night, the same file resting in her car when he arrested her. His case file. And with an unwavering voice, she delivered her verdict. Guilty of excessive force, referred for federal civil rights prosecution, and responsible for the racial profiling and unlawful arrest of a sitting judge. Horton collapsed into his hands, sobbing as the finality of it landed. But Sarah wasn't finished. She referred Sergeant Webb for supervisory negligence, Lieutenant Dresden for obstruction of justice, and the police department was officially placed under internal and federal review. The gavel fell not just on Horton, but on a system that had gone unchecked for far too long. The gallery rose into stunned silence. Justice wasn't whispered that day, it was thunder. The fallout came with the force of a storm tearing through foundations long considered unshakable. Within days, the Fulton County Police Department found itself under intense public pressure, federal scrutiny, and internal upheaval. Press conferences erupted outside the courthouse as reporters demanded answers, accountability, reform. Captain Reed, now thrust unwillingly into the spotlight, stood before cameras acknowledging that the department was under investigation for pattern-based civil rights violations. Questions flew like arrows. Was the judge targeted? How many incidents were buried? Who approved the cover-ups? Behind him, the department scrambled to control a narrative that could no longer be controlled. Horton was arrested within the week, charged under federal civil rights statutes and state laws designed to hold officers accountable for misconduct. Webb faced disciplinary action, demotion, oversight. Dresden quietly accepted early retirement to avoid losing his pension, though the stain on his record would follow him forever. Meanwhile, Tyler Brooks, the rookie whose silence at the traffic stop had weighed on him like guilt, became the unexpected turning point in the story. His decision to bring the dashcam evidence to internal affairs, risking retaliation, positioned him as the lone officer who chose integrity over loyalty. He became the example everyone pointed to, the one who broke the chain of silence. But for Sarah, the goal was never to destroy careers. It was to reveal truth, rebuild trust, and force a broken system to confront itself. A week after the verdict, she met with the police chief, handing him a list of reforms so comprehensive it stunned him. Mandatory bias training, external oversight boards, transparent disciplinary procedures, public data reporting, independent auditing of body cam protocols. She didn't ask, she required. And with the threat of federal oversight looming, the chief agreed. The system that once allowed Horton to operate unchecked was being dismantled piece by piece. For the first time in years, the people of Fulton County saw more than a scandal. They saw the beginning of change. And at the center of it all stood a woman who refused to let injustice go unanswered. But change didn't stop at reforms or headlines. It built momentum in quieter, more personal ways. Jordan Williams, the teenager from Horton's original excessive force case, returned to the courthouse weeks later, holding a document with his expunged record. He approached Sarah with gratitude, but beyond his thanks was something more powerful: direction. He had enrolled in a criminal justice program, inspired by what he witnessed in her courtroom, with plans to pursue law and dedicate himself to the very justice system that once nearly broke him. Sarah saw in him a future prosecutor, a future advocate, a future force for fairness. Moments like that reminded her why the fight mattered, why one night in a holding cell did not weaken her, but instead sharpened her purpose. Meanwhile, Tyler Brooks stepped into a new chapter. Internal Affairs hired him as a probationary detective, one of the youngest in the division's history. He faced isolation within the department, cold shoulders from peers, whispers behind his back, but he pressed forward. His father's words echoed in him every day: be the officer people need, not the one they fear. And for Sarah, every new case that crossed her desk carried a new resonance. She reviewed evidence with deeper scrutiny, weighed testimonies with sharper intuition, and pushed for accountability with unwavering clarity. She didn't speak publicly about her arrest. She didn't seek interviews or sympathy. Her power wasn't in telling her story, it was in shaping outcomes. In her chambers late at night, she often paused to look at the scuffs on her Merced's door, not as a reminder of fear, but as a physical mark of the night that changed everything. A night that exposed a truth too many people already knew, but too few had the authority to challenge. And when she walked into the courtroom each morning, she carried not just the weight of the robe, but the responsibility of creating a justice system worthy of the trust placed in it. This wasn't reform for a headline. It was reform for a generation. Months passed, and the ripple effects of the case continued shaping the community. Investigations deepened, new policies emerged, and officers who once operated with unchecked authority found themselves accountable in ways they had never experienced. Training programs shifted. Supervisors evaluated stops with a new lens. Data became transparent, and community oversight boards attended meetings that previously happened behind closed doors. But the true transformation revealed itself in the people who had once feared the system. Drivers came forward with stories long buried. Community members attended hearings to support one another, and slowly, trust, fragile but real, began to rebuild. Sarah watched all of it unfold from her courtroom bench, not with pride, but with a steady resolve. She knew change wasn't a moment, it was a process, and the process would outlast scandal, headlines, or public outrage. One afternoon, Tyler arrived in her chambers with a new case file, another officer, another complaint, another chance to keep the system honest. He carried himself differently now, firmer, more grounded, unconcerned with the opinions of those who resented his integrity. Sarah reviewed the report meticulously, offering guidance with the quiet authority of someone who had lived the consequences of both action and inaction. The courtroom felt different now, as though the echo of that explosive morning still lingered in its walls, reminding everyone that accountability was no longer optional. Horton remained behind bars awaiting trial, a symbol of what happened when power was abused and truth was ignored. Webb struggled through her demotion, learning firsthand that command came with responsibility, not immunity. Dresden's early retirement faded into obscurity as new leadership took root. Through it all, Sarah continued her work, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a judge committed to upholding the law the way it was meant to be upheld. And every time she passed the courthouse steps, she was reminded that justice, though slow, was possible when someone refused to look away. In the end, the story that began on a dark stretch of highway became far larger than one arrest, one officer, or one courtroom. It became a catalyst for structural change, a reminder that accountability begins when the right person refuses to stay silent. Sarah's life returned to its rhythm, long cases, heavy files, late nights. But she wasn't the same woman who drove home that night. She was sharper, more resolute, more aware of how easily power can be twisted when left unchecked. Yet she also saw how a single act of courage, like a rookie officer submitting evidence despite fear, could alter the course of an entire department. When she closed her chambers each evening, she didn't dwell on the night in the holding cell. Instead, she focused on the faces of people like Jordan Williams, on the reforms being implemented, on the officers discovering what integrity looked like when accountability was real. And as she walked through the quiet courthouse halls, she knew the system would never be perfect, but she also knew she had shifted its trajectory. Not with anger, not with vengeance, with truth. Her story became a testament that justice, when wielded with patience and precision, has the power to break cycles that once seemed unbreakable. It became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, when prejudice, arrogance, and abuse of power collide, there is always a path towards something better if someone is willing to walk it. She sat alone in her chambers one last time before heading home, looking at the robe draped across the back of her chair, understanding fully what it meant now. Authority was not a shield, it was a responsibility, and she chose to carry that responsibility with clarity. As she locked the door and stepped into the evening air, the world felt different, still flawed, still imperfect, but shifting. And she whispered to herself what she wished every listener would understand. Justice isn't loud, it isn't fast, but when it finally arrives, it changes everything. If you want more stories like this, true, powerful, cinematic narratives, make sure to subscribe, follow, and turn on notifications. Your next story begins the moment this one ends.